Welcome, everyone. My name is Curtis Woloschuk. I'm the Director of Programming at the Vancouver International Film Festival, and very excited to be joined by Pier-Philippe Chevigny, writer-director of Richelieu, which was at the Vancouver International Film Festival this past fall. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that VIFF's work takes place on the traditional unceded territories of Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh people. VIFF is an organization that's largely run by settlers and immigrants, and consequently, we recognize we have a responsibility to build meaningful relationships with Indigenous artists, curators, organizations, and community leaders, and it's work we're committed to doing. Pier-Philippe, welcome back virtually to Vancouver. It was a pleasure to have the film here in the fall, and to give folks a bit of background, this is a film that premiered last summer at Carlo Vivari and found its way to Canadian shores at Fantasia in Montreal, and has really just continued on this course ever since, and recently picked up four Canadian Screen Awards.
Six, actually.
Was it six? Thank you. Thank God someone was doing the math. I'm not a numbers guy, but including Best Motion Picture, actress in a leading role, or actor in a leading role, actor in a supporting role, cinematography, and give me the other two.
Best First Feature and Casting, Achievement in Casting.
All very deserved. So thank you for correcting me on the last two as well, because those are notable, and I think they're things we can kind of delve into with the film. Now that I'm curious now that it's almost been in the world for like 9 months, and you've shown it to different audiences in many corners of the globe. Has your relationship with the film changed at all? As your kind of understanding of what it is and what it represents shifted over the course of sharing it with other audiences?
I don't know. I'm sick of watching it for sure by now, but I'm always surprised by the reaction. And the one thing that keeps coming back is because it's such a political film, and because it tells stuff about Canada that's not very fun or stuff that we don't want to acknowledge. And everywhere I've shown it in the world, people are like surprised to find out that Canada has exploitation and racism and intolerance. I think that's probably not the thing that I'm most proud necessarily, but for sure that was the biggest surprise, to see just how much Canada has, the image of being like a country of human rights, and kind of the film shatters that image in a way, and I think that was universal. I've shown the film a lot in France, especially in the past few months, and that's the number one reaction. People just don't expect these types of things to happen here in Canada, so that was surprising for sure.
Particularly when traveling before the pandemic in Europe, I found like the two things that Europeans wanted to talk to me about were Justin Trudeau and Xavier Dolan. So I'm glad that you're broadening European.
Yes, let's talk about modern day slavery now.
Yeah, but and I don't mean to make light of it, obviously, but
No.
one memory I have of the Vancouver screenings, or the one I hosted with you, was there was a group of migrant workers who were at the screening, who worked in the Fraser Valley and in the Lower Mainland, and they had the opportunity to tell some of their own stories. Of their experiences, but I thought also, very they acknowledged that they felt that you'd got a lot of the details right about the film, and maybe you can start just by talking about how you work to try to ensure honoring these stories, and maybe the research process, and how you guarded against any sort of assumptions on your side in this space.
Right. And that's going to be an interesting story, because we started research on this project I've been researching for 10 years basically, but what we did now 6 years ago is we went to Guatemala, and I just came back now 6 years later from a tour in Guatemala to show the film to some of the workers who talked to us. And basically the research began because I'd read about the temporary foreign workers program, and how especially activist groups were describing it as a form of modern day slavery. And back then, people weren't really talking about it that much. Now it just so happens in the last few years we've talked about it a lot, you know. But back then it was more like hearsay, and I wanted to verify whether those allegations were true or not. And my intention initially was to make a documentary. And so I went back to my birthplace, basically the Richelieu Valley, which is about 40 kilometers south of Montreal, and very agriculture based, a lot of foreign workers there. And I started asking questions, and then I realized why, you know, so few people were talking about it. It's just that people who were experiencing forms of exploitation didn't want to speak out because they were afraid of losing their jobs, basically. And that's when my project became a narrative feature instead, because through fiction, I could tell the truth, but I could also protect the anonymity of people who were talking to me. And so I wrote a script first, or should I say a synopsis based on the stuff that workers here told me, and then I went to Guatemala to kind of verify those allegations. And we did this about 10-day tour in 2018, 2019, can't remember. And I just got the testimony of everyone, and you know, made sure that I would use it in a way that you know, I would protect their identity. That was the main concern. They really wanted to speak out. They wanted people to know that stuff like this happens, but they really didn't want to be identified. And so the script was a collage of those testimonies, but written in a way that people couldn't find out really who they were. And now we went back to Guatemala because most of these people, they still work in Canada. They still come here every summer. And when they're here, they're working all the time. So they don't have time to just watch movies. So the only way, like, to kind of show it to them, I could have sent a link, I mean, but it felt like a better end to that story to just go back and reconnect with them and show it to them. And it was a very hard thing just to pull off, making this tour, going back, because some of them, they're not there anymore. Some of them are now living in the States, undocumented. Some of them were afraid because they didn't want to be associated with the film, so they just didn't want to see the final thing. But the screenings that did happen with the people were just so powerful and so emotional because you know, it felt, and it was the same when we were screening it in Canada. When workers are there and they see it on film and we do Q&As afterwards, it's not a Q&A, it becomes an open mic session, because then people just want to tell their stories, and we just listen and we just empathize with what they've been through. And that was really what the whole tour was about. And also because that was the first time that their families were seeing what happens when they're in Quebec. Basically, that was a big turning point. Also because, you know, some of these workers, they come to Quebec 11 months a year. They barely ever see their families, and their families have many misconceptions of what happens when they're here. And so also, that was also really interesting to hear what the wives and the children had to say about their fathers. Was really, really touching. But yeah.
Yeah, it just sounds like a really powerful experience, and I don't know if rewarding is the right word, but like the right way maybe to close that loop as well, to
Right. Right.
create that space where, again, there are stories that put this film in motion, allows an opportunity for their own stories to be shared in that space again, and a
Exactly.
greater understanding and appreciation being
Yeah.
established. You mentioned that this is filmed in the area where you grew up, and um, was yeah, maybe in your youth or early adulthood, like what was kind of your awakening to maybe some of the practices that were going on these
Mhm.
farms, and that also helped spark this story.
Yeah. So without going into detail, because I'm also protecting the
Mm.
identity of Canadian citizens who talk to me, but there was someone you know, close to me who worked in a factory, and that person was the one who kind of hooked me into looking more into it. I had also done like short films on the very same issue when I was at university. basically my education was very based around social issues, and it's something I've always been very sensitive to. But 10 years ago, that person worked in that environment and like told me, come with me, look into this with me, and let's try to make things change. And also, yeah, my intention would have been at some point for the film to be used by activists and union groups to demand change, because nothing's going to change unless the law changes. It's the temporary foreign workers program allows exploitation to happen. We just need to fix that. And so by making that film, my intention, of course, was to make a good film and have people being engaged. But I also wanted to give ammunition to activist groups so they could use it and show it. And the past few months, that's what happened. There's a lot of unions who asked us for the rights of the film, and we gave them away for free so that they could show it to their members and spark as much debate as possible. And so we did that. Like I did that tour, going back there and show them the result of the film itself. But my deepest wish would be that this film eventually leads to change, and that would make a difference in their lives for sure. So yeah, I guess to circle back to your question, like initially it's someone kind of pulled my arm and brought me along her journey in this world. That's without saying too much, that
Yeah.
would be like the initial spark for the project.
Well, it strikes me there's the obvious pivot point or slow pivot when you've done this research with a journalistic approach to it, or almost a documentary framework in terms of the research. But then there's the need to craft this into a narrative as well that embodies the concerns, or has the concerns at the forefront, but also adheres to all the dramatic necessities of a film as well. And
Yeah.
both Ariane and Nelson, your lead and one of their key supporting actors, were recognized by the Canadian Screen Awards for their performances in this film. But maybe you can speak a little bit to kind of the envisioning or the conception of Ariane's
Yeah.
as the entryway into this world as well.
Well, I think that also touches, to your point about the previous question, like who am I to tell that story? And I think that, we can tell stories if we do the research and everything, but at some point it's also about your own comfort in it, and choosing the point of view of the translator rather than the point of view of the worker himself felt like a middle ground that I was more comfortable in. Like telling that very same story through the eyes of Manuel, I'm not sure I would have been the right person to tell that story. But Ariane is kind of a middle ground because she's Quebecer. She grew up there. She knows that environment. She's also she has a Guatemalan father, so she's kind of in between. You could argue that I still don't have the legitimacy to tell that story, but it felt like this was a position that I could be comfortable in telling that story. So that was part of it, but also telling the story through the eyes of Ariane, the translator, was the only way to see both sides of the argument, like because she's the only one who's who can show us the boss's environment, but also the workers' environment, and no other character in that environment could show these two sides. And so it made a more complete portrait, a more nuanced portrait, because you could actually see that both sides are struggling. And that was more interesting to me than just telling the story through the eyes of the workers. And also there's been tons and tons and tons of migrant workers films throughout the years told through their perspective. And I think my film doesn't say everything about the issue. It says something, and it says things that other films don't say. So and that's part of the result of choosing Ariane's perspective.
And with the casting of Nelson Coronado, who plays Manuel, he's someone who, if you look at his IMDb page, yeah, previous roles are like, don't their characters don't even have names.
Mhm.
So background performers or things like this are so supporting that they don't warrant a name themselves. So,
Yeah.
can you speak? You mentioned the nomination for casting in the film and just your process of finding actors like Nelson to inhabit
Yeah.
these roles.
Yeah. So like to me, it was super important that all of the actors were authentically Guatemalan. And initially, the idea was to cast actors in Guatemala, not just take Canadian citizens, that have Guatemalan background, but actually go over there, cast people over there. What was most important was that if a Guatemalan audience were to watch the film, they'd recognize their accents, it would feel authentic to them. And that's what we tried. We actually did a casting over there with Jairo Bustamante, who's a very famous Guatemalan director. He did auditions. Actually, his team held auditions for us, and we had an initial cast. All of people from were actually Guatemalan citizens. And what happened was COVID. So we couldn't have all of them come. Only two of them managed to get their visa in time. It was really, really difficult during the pre-production process. And so I had to redo my whole casting basically 2 weeks before we started shooting. And Nelson is an actual Guatemalan, of course, but the reason why he wasn't given the role initially was because the role of Manuel was written as an indigenous Guatemalan man who spoke Caxiquel, which is a native tongue in Guatemala. And there was that entire other layer in the script that Spanish wasn't even his first language. But it was just not possible to have the actor come in time. And so I went back to the auditions that we did in Montreal, and Nelson, he was really great during the audition. The only reason like he wasn't cast for that role specifically was because I envisioned an indigenous man initially. And so we rewrote the part for him, and it was amazing. I mean, I thought I cast him for another role, though. He was already cast in the film, but it was just one of the other workers. And like you said, that he basically had no experience at all in terms of speaking role. He had done like extra work and stuff like that. So um, I was really, really impressed by his audition for sure. And we made sure like to understand what his limits were. And the character has one sequence where there's a lot of dialogue. In that sequence, we rehearsed it a lot to make sure that he was comfortable because he had so few experience in everything. Uh, but overall, I was constantly impressed with him. He has it. The fact that he doesn't have experience doesn't take away the fact that he has talent, and it's been his lifelong dream to become an actor. So hopefully, this opens new doors for him for sure.
In terms of kind of building this fraternal element between the actors playing the workers, and maybe it's just the logistics of shooting where you were shooting. I'm wondering, are you a director who like that kept people together a lot, or was it a matter of like people having to just like actually accommodate themselves in close proximity when you weren't shooting? Like, was that just one of the realities of the shoot? Or did
Well,
the COVID considerations kind of play into this as well during production?
Well, what happened for the workers that came from outside of Montreal, they had a huge Airbnb together, and like they became like really, really close. But what happened on set is all of the extras, they're all Guatemalan also. And we got the nomination at the CSAs, and it's actually Ariane Castellanos who's nominated for casting because she did the casting for the film. And she went around in Guatemalan cafes in Montreal to try to find extras who were actually Guatemalan, and ask for phone numbers and can you call your dad, maybe you'd be good for that and stuff like that. So uh, on set, it was kind of a it felt like Guatemalan Independence Day every day, because there were so many Guatemalans who were proud and really enthusiastic about the film. Finally, somebody's making a film about Guatemalan people in Quebec. There's such a small community in Quebec specifically. Um, so there certainly were a lot of new friendships that emerged on set. And we had a barbecue not so long ago in a park, and a bunch of the extras came back, and I kind of find out that they all kept in touch together. They really all became friends. And the scene around the campfire, I think was very emotional for a lot of them, because we kind of recreated the Independence Day, and there was a huge Guatemalan flag in the background and stuff like that. So people were really, really passionate about the film, and that's certainly one thing that moved me a lot. And when we did the screening also in Montreal, the first screening on opening night, everybody came. It felt like we were shooting that scene again.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Maybe we can't move on from casting, or it would be remiss if I didn't ask you about your use of Marc-André Grandin in the film, who like VIFF audiences would have probably first seen in Crazy
Right.
some years ago, and very recognizable Montreal or Quebec actor, but very. I think maybe at first glance one would say like this is a different role for him.
Right.
But for myself, I think when you talk about wanting to tell both sides of this story, um, the humanity he brings to this conflicted, ostensibly, or what could be a very clear villainous role,
Right.
is more complex than that. And
Right.
maybe if you could speak a little to your decision to utilize a recognizable face such as him,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then how you wanted to create the greater complexity to Stefan as a character.
Right. So that character on paper, I thought was kind of a villain. Um, and I fought a lot, but I got feedback from a lot of people that he feels like a villain, and I didn't want that. I wanted not to excuse his behavior, of course, but I wanted people to at least understand what his motivations were, and try to paint a more complex picture. And so the idea of casting Marc-André is also because my first audience is Quebec. So to them, I know that Marc-André Grondin is this huge star that we are very used to seeing in leading roles and playing mostly good guys. He's done a few bad guys also, but mostly he's an actor who we're used to relating to. And I wanted to break the bad boss stereotype as much as possible and have someone that you wouldn't hate from the get-go. And as the story progresses, you eventually becomes the full-on antagonist, and there's no coming back. Because I think, as much as I wanted to paint a nuanced portrait, I think also some people are scumbags too, and need to be called out. And so yeah, that was the idea. And we talked about that a lot in pre-production with Marc-André, how to make sure that that character was as nuanced and as vulnerable as possible, so we don't hate him and he's not, too much of a villain. And there's tons of stuff that Marc-André himself brought to the table that wasn't in the script. Very, very subtle things, like at one point they're having a phone conversation with the French boss, and he throws the phone on the wall. And in the original script, he would storm off, from the office, and we just stay with the reactions of everybody. And Marc-André suggested instead, no, I'll sit back down and I'll say to everybody, look, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. Just so that he acknowledges that he went too far in that point. So tons of little details like that,
Mhm.
very subtle stuff that he brought, but I think really helped us make that character as nuanced as possible.
Well, I do want to touch upon the cinematography as well, but before that, I was actually intrigued by the sound design of the film. I think that that scene where we see the workers on the bus, like there's just this kind of like metallic rattling to the bus as well, which I think particularly if you see the film in the theater is um, ominous in a sense, and also kind of like creates this sonic enclosure for them. And I think it's mirrored in some respects with like the machinery we hear on the farm later on. And yeah, if you're comfortable kind of going into like just how you envisioned and worked through the sound design for the film and how that could kind of inform the tenor of the workspace as well, or the
Yeah.
farm.
Yeah, totally. So there's very, very few music in the film, and the idea was to use sound design almost in a musical way. To whether it's like the factory machine noises or the rattling bus, stuff like that. Use sound effects that have a tone that that are interesting and that kind of feel invasive. And because like the whole idea was to make you feel when we're inside a factory, it has to be not a nice place to be. So it needs to be noisy and really tense, and the choice of industrial ventilation and stuff like that was really done with the ear of a musician. And like, let's use noise as a score almost. There's if you pay attention, there's drones and there's a lot of stuff going on. It's actually real ventilations, but it's used in a way that it almost feels like music. And I thought that was interesting. There is a little bit of music in the film, but I personally really really like um, when I can't identify musical instrument. It kind of takes me
Mm-hmm.
out of the story when suddenly I can hear a piano. I'm not saying that in absolute terms, but when I make my films, I try to like have all the sound be as organic and come from what's happening in the story as much as possible. So yeah, I think that was the reflection behind the sound design.
And this film saw, your continued collaboration with your cinematographer, Gabrielle, as well. I think again, I suppose, just curious to know about like your ongoing work together and how that informs. I think there's an immediacy to the film. There's a lot of
Right.
like following of characters as they're moving through space. So you have this sense of movement many
Right.
times, but also operating like very intimate proximity as well. And
Yeah.
and maybe just some of almost the choreography between cinematographer and actors on set and how that was achieved.
Yeah. I'm not sure we mentioned it, but Gabriel also got a nomination for Best DP at the CSA, which kind of surprised me because it's a very realistically
Mm.
lit film. It's not like gorgeous. It's kind of dark and gritty, but I think that the one thing that really probably stood out to people is the use of over the shoulder camera, which Gabriel operates himself, and sometimes very very long one shot takes. And yeah, my approach to filmmaking is very much based on the frame. I have very, very precise ideas of how I want to frame and how I want the camera to move around. And the idea is always to make it as immersive as possible. I want the audience to feel like they're in there, living the events in real time alongside the characters. Which is why I do long shots, because like it's a long moment without cuts, and so you live the events literally in real time with the characters. And the over-the-shoulder camera stays really close to the character. We're like entirely focused on them, whether it's Ariane or whether we're following Manuel. I want the entire audience to be dedicated to them and pay attention to them and make you feel like you're in there, like uh, you're going a friend of yours is going through a tough time in their life, and you're being present for them. That's kind of the feeling that I want the audience to feel, like the hospital scene, you're in there with them, they're going through hell, and you feel like you almost have a moral responsibility to be there with them because they're alone. That was kind of the idea. But in general, with the way I use camera, to be as close as possible to the character, to make the audience feel almost responsible, and to be as engaged within the action as possible.
I think, yeah, that's perhaps an excellent note to end on as well. Just the making the audience feel responsible, because I think it's one of those films that does shake a viewer, and I think is it bears importance in the fact that it kind of assails the stories we tell about ourselves, or the assumptions that others make about how life and work is conducted in this
Mhm.
country as well. So
Mhm.
I thank you for joining us today, and for talking more about the film, and congratulations on the fact it continues to find its way to audiences. I know you're boarding a plane again to continue this world tour, and for myself, very happy to hear you were able to share it with the folks in Guatemala as well.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.